This week we're talking about the neurology of gender and why men and women express and process emotions differently. Is gender a social construct? Maybe to some degree, but there's definitely a biological component to it. A biological component that could explain why men and women express, process, relate with their emotions differently. Of course, we're still talking about the APA guidelines on working with men and boys from last week that said men need to express emotions like women to be healthy. Of course, the guidelines don't literally say that, but that's what's implied. Men need to be more like women. Men need to process their emotions, express their emotions more like women. Don't fight, don't compete, don't be aggressive, which is usually a pejorative term for what? Asserting your anger. And instead be more like women. Well, maybe there's some neurological, biological factors that explain why men and women will process emotions differently. One of those reasons being the prefrontal cortex. In men, the prefrontal cortex is more connected with the amygdala. I think a couple weeks ago I drew a diagram, a super accurate diagram of the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala and the hippocampus and how they all link up. And a good determinant of regulation is to the extent to which the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus are linked up with the amygdala. And in men, it's naturally linked up more, leading to calmer emotional states. They don't feel their emotions as viscerally. Well, you'll see. We'll get to that. And also, women have a larger amygdala. It's just bigger. They're going to be more aware of certain threats than men are. They're going to be more in tune with their environment because they have a larger amygdala. So larger amygdala, not as connected with the prefrontal cortex. Oxytocin, another difference between the neurology of men and women. Women have more of it, and it makes them feel better to get more oxytocin. Oxytocin is a chemical. It's most prevalent in the bond between mother and her child. That's where it's the most prevalent. And it really aids that bonding a lot, but it aids all social bonding. So think of sitting in a warm, cozy ski lodge, comforted by a blanket, you have some hot cocoa, there's a fire going in the fireplace, you're talking about your emotions, you're connecting. What a beautiful scenario. That's oxytocin. Men need it too, of course, not as much as women, and when we get too much of it, kind of feels sick. It's like it gives us this sick sort of feeling, a lot like when you eat a lot of candy. A couple candy bars, oh, this is great, but if you have 10 candy bars, you go, this is just kind of disgusting. And it makes sense because too much oxytocin in men does lower testosterone. So that's another difference. Women, much better at associations. We're going to get to it. And our temporal lobes are different. Maybe the size isn't different, but in women, it's much more connected to other parts of the limbic system, and it's more connected to the prefrontal cortex. The temporal lobe is, well, it's in charge of a lot of things, but ever walk into a room and you can take a temperature, you take the temperature of the room, the emotional, the social temperature of the room, that's your temporal lobes working. And in men, maybe they're just as big, but they're less connected to other parts of our brain. That's why in autistic children, I guess autistic adults too, temporal lobe, it's there, but it's not as connected. And a lot of FaceTime with the caregiver, preferably the mother early on, it builds this connection with the temporal lobe. But in men, the connection is just not as present. And this is, feel free to look this up. Nobody's going to dispute these 3 points. So what does this mean when it comes to expressing our emotions? Well, women are going to be much more visceral with their emotions. Men, much more logical, more reasonable, more linear. No woman is ever going to come up with a diagram of your emotions like this. This came from a dude's brain, no question. And it makes sense that a lot of the pushback, or most of the pushback, maybe not most of the pushback, but a lot of the most visceral pushback that I've received from these diagrams have come from women. Intelligent women, perhaps more intelligent than I, maybe much more intelligent, but just the fact that I'm telling them that our emotions are linear, it's not how they experience an emotion. How could you make a diagram? First of all, how could you ever say there's only two emotions, and how could you ever make a diagram out of it? You must be repressing, and I have been accused of repressing emotions, even though this diagram is the opposite. This is repression, opposite day. It shows you how to not do it, specifically step by step, of course. More of a linear, logical, reasonable way to deal with our emotions than a woman does. Men, much more inclined to go after goals. Women, much more inclined to create associations. And we can show this, probably how a man feels when he reaches a goal, when he gets successful, makes more money, gets a promotion. That's probably how a woman feels when she creates associations. So it makes sense why women make 140% of what men make in sales. A career that's all about creating associations. And of course, women have more empathy. It's a stereotype. And it's a stereotype for a reason, because it's true. Women do have more empathy than men. Men, much more likely to understand. We understand emotions. I understand where you're coming from. Women, because of these reasons here, more in touch, but I feel where you're coming from. Now, maybe these differences, you're thinking, maybe this is just a social construct. We have these differences. You said it right there, Mark. The amount of FaceTime that a baby has with its mother or any other caregiver determines to some extent to the extent that their temporal lobes are connected with the rest of their brain. So maybe women are just raised differently, creating different connections in their brain. Maybe to some extent. I'm not saying there's no social construction to this, but we look at one factor that can explain this much better and in a much more simpler way than social constructivism, and I think we have a better explanation. And that one factor is, of course, a chemical, a hormone, one of the most beautiful things to ever exist, testosterone. We look at the way testosterone influences our brains, and it explains all this and then some. And we have a lot of good research now, because now we have women transitioning into men. And what do they take to transition? Part of the transition process is testosterone. So we can see what happens to a woman's brain when they increase their testosterone by 2 or 3 times. And what starts to happen? They're more reasonable with their emotions. They are more goal-oriented. They have less empathy. In fact, empathy decreases linearly. It's a 1-to-1 correlation as testosterone increases. And it's not like men have 2 or 3 times the amount of testosterone that women have. We have 30 times. It's sometimes even more than that. And it's almost impossible to find a woman walking around who has more testosterone than men. Probably about the most amount of testosterone a woman is going to have is about 60 nanograms per deciliter. There. It's very rare to find a man, even a 70 or 80-year-old man, who has less than 200. And if I take your testosterone level and double it, even simply double it, if you're a woman, take it from 60 nanograms per deciliter to 120, give you a personality test before and after, you present as 2 different people. If you're just looking at the personality test, it's like you think the 2 different people have taken this test. And men have at least 30, perhaps 40, even 50 times the amount of testosterone that women have, especially in late teens and early 20s. And, those women who transition to men, they're taking testosterone with already a woman's brain, already a different brain. And even then, even when the study is handicapped with that, then they still present as more of a man, at least have a much different personality even, again, if you double the testosterone. Now, this may seem sexist to you. Maybe this even seems like misogyny. I mean, I'm basically saying that men are more reasonable. I'm saying they're more logical. I'm saying that women, visceral, that's a really nice word for hysterical, isn't it? This is sexist. This is misogyny. No, that's you putting those value judgments on somebody who's more visceral with their emotions. It is an extremely helpful, beneficial, oxytocin, nurturing thing that there are beings out there, magical creatures who are more visceral with their emotions. It goes into, we don't have a proper development of a human brain without that. But I'm not even talking about the social benefits of it. It feels good. There's nothing wrong with being more visceral, with caring more about building associations, with having more empathy. We make these pejoratives because you're right. There is misogyny in our culture, and it comes from people who think that being visceral with your emotions is in any way bad, is in any way negative. Since feminism, we think that women have more power. They become more accepting of who they are. They taken back the night, whatever it happens to be. No, that's not what's happened at all. We now only accept women to the extent that they present as men, as they're more logical, as they're more goal-oriented. Have a career. You don't need a man. That's the misogyny. We have not accepted women, not at all. If anything, since the 50s, we become less accepting of women. We only accept them to the extent that they have become men. And that is extremely damaging to women. We think that women are, making more money, holding more positions in academia. Yeah, that's just the surface. What's underneath is women are much less happy than men. They're much more miserable, and they keep getting more and more miserable because we tell them who they are biologically, what most of them were meant to do. It's wrong. And if you disagree with that, maybe you live in a different part of the country, but where I live, try going to a cocktail party and telling everybody that you're a stay-at-home mom. And the greatest thing you could ever do as a woman is raise children. I'm not saying that women all wouldn't have to do that, but try to go to a cocktail party around where I live and say that. Versus, I just got a promotion, I'm a CEO of a company, whatever, I'm a head of a startup, for a woman to say that. Two completely different reactions. So who's the real misogynist? I leave that question with you. Also, I leave with you. Like and subscribe. You know what to do. Tell a friend. Talk about these just basic facts about the differences between men and women. All this is easily validated. Just Google it. But our ideology may say otherwise. That's it for this week. Take care, guys. And in the meantime, always accept your emotions for whatever they are and process them however you feel like you need to.